Welcome to part 2 of Uncle Larry's truly massive rant. Uncle Larry is going to pick up where he left off in part 1, but first he wants to mention that after part 1 aired, he got some phone calls from people who said, Uncle Larry, we went and saw The Mummy, and that was also totally stupid, and that made like $45 million in its first weekend. What do you think of that? Aren't you upset? Isn't that proof that the country is going to hell and everybody's getting stupider? In a word, no. See, boys and girls, The Mummy is an action-adventure fantasy in the style of Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's an homage to those cheesy B-movie Saturday matinee serials like Zombies of the Stratosphere, which were essentially made for children. So The Mummy, it doesn't have to make sense. It's just an excuse to throw a bunch of great special effects at you. And they are truly awesome special effects, boys and girls. Far, far better than those in The Matrix. The Matrix, on the other hand, is science fiction. That's how it's, marketing itself. That's how it starts off. And in science fiction, the science is equally as important as the fiction. Just the way it is. Science fiction is generally for people of a slightly above average intelligence, and The Matrix was a total insult to them, so if you liked it, you're still a fucking moron. That's the bottom line. But go see The Mummy. It's loaded with really great, awesome special effects. Now, that brings us up to the rest of this rant. Uncle Larry's going to go really fast because he has a lot to cram in a very limited amount of time because of the really big shoe that we have tonight. Uncle Larry wants to talk about a movie that kind of combines that type of action-adventure fantasy that is The Mummy with science fiction, and that is Star Wars. Okay? Now, Star Wars, it's not true science fiction, boys and girls. It's space opera. And what that is it's essentially a fantasy that's just got some technological trappings. It's not really meant to be taken seriously. Now, when your good old Uncle Larry saw Star Wars the first time in 77, he was 17, and he hated it. He loathed it. He thought it was the biggest piece of crap he ever saw because he went in there expecting he was going to see science fiction. And in fact, Uncle Larry didn't understand why Frank Herbert didn't sue the pants off George Lucas for ripping off all those concepts for Star Wars out of Dune. For instance, when James Cameron stole some ideas from Harlan Ellison for Terminator, Harlan sued his ass and made like $1 bajillion, and now every copy of Terminator has to say based on concepts created by Harlan Ellison at the beginning of the movie. But Uncle Larry guesses that Frank was probably too busy dealing with Dino De Laurentiis' Dune, and then after that he was busy dying of cancer, so he never got around to it. But at any rate, the important thing is the second time Uncle Larry went to see Star Wars, he saw it with a group of friends. He sat farther back so the special effects didn't look quite so cheesy, and he really enjoyed it because he wasn't expecting science fiction. He just wanted to see a mindless action-adventure fantasy, which is what Star Wars is. And kudos to the second Star Wars movie, The Empire Strikes Back. It really is the best of the three. Not only that, Empire Strikes Back is the finest example of pre-CGI special effects. It's the finest non-computer generated special effects movie. It's where they actually manipulated the effects of light on film to produce the effects rather than just having a computer make up all the images and then downloading it directly to film. That's really not important. What's important is it's a great movie, but it's totally ruined by Yoda. Uncle Larry just can't get past Yoda. He hates that fucking little puppet that sounds like Grover, alright? Just spoiled the whole series for Uncle Larry. He just couldn't buy it. It's a fucking puppet, okay? But the point is... What is the point? Oh, okay. Star Wars was hugely popular. It was hugely and immensely popular. It was so popular that George Lucas actually had made over $600 million on the sequel that's coming out now before he even ground a foot of film, purely by selling the marketing rights. It cost $125 million, but he'd already made $500 million before. And that's because, hey, we're in a country where consumerism is the main religion. People went and saw Star Wars again and again and again because it satisfied a need for a kind of a fantasy world that we have. According to John Campbell, who's a dead, overrated anthropologist, Star Wars, the trilogy, contains a lot of elements that are basic to myth structures, and basic cultures. So it satisfies a need for people to know that, good is going to triumph over evil, and the bad guys always get theirs in the end. But it's it's fantasy bullshit, boys and girls. It's fantasy bullshit. This whole concept of everything being black and white. Star Wars is just an embodiment of it. The ultimate good versus the ultimate evil. And in real life, boys and girls, it's not like that. People like to see things in black and white because it's easier for them. The problem is, this is the 20th century, okay? And there was a guy called Albert Einstein. He worked out something called the theory of relativity, which totally changed the way everybody thought, not only about science, but about life in general and philosophy. Because the theory of relativity says that anything you observe, that the state of anything you observe, just depends on where you are in relation to it when you're looking at it. Everything's conditional, boys and girls. It all depends on your viewpoint. And that's something that modern people just can't handle. Nobody wants to deal with that fact, that sort of sliding scale. People want to see things in black and white, even though truly it's all just shades of gray. Now, if you put a very, very dark shade of gray next to a very, very light shade of gray, they might look like black and white. You might look at it and go, it's black and white. You put them together, that's what it looks like. But if you actually put something that's truly black next to that dark gray, you can see that it's just dark gray. Or if you put something truly light next to the light gray, right, something truly white, you'll see that it's actually shades of gray. And most things in life are like a slightly darker shade of gray next to a just slightly lighter shade of gray. It's very hard to distinguish. It takes brain power. It's something you have to think about, and that's what people don't like to do. That slightly darker, slightly lighter shade of gray, it all comes down to like the individual versus society. There's a problem that's two almost totally similar shades of gray. It's the major problem facing humanity since we become civilized. The individual's rights versus the rights of society. The good of the few and the good of the many, not to quote Star Trek, God forbid. And what's really important is that those slightly darker shades of gray, what we call evil, well, it's in all of us, boys and girls. There is no ultimate good and ultimate evil. It's something that's within us all. And that brings us to Eric Dylan and the Littleton, Colorado slangs. LC, isn't that great? One of Uncle Larry's favorite LCs these days. All right, these guys went in and killed a baker's dozen of their peers, their high school, and then, shot themselves. And everybody's making a big stink about it, when really, it's no big deal. It's just an excuse for the media to flog themselves into a frenzy and fill the time. Now, these guys went in and killed a bunch of their peers in high school, okay? Obviously, they're crazy, but it's not an entirely irrational response, and Uncle Larry will get to that. The really ironic thing is that Eric and Dylan are exactly the sort of adolescent, alienated male loners that watch Uncle Larry's Clubhouse. They're like poster boys for Uncle Larry's prime demographic. Now, because they've done this thing, and because people like to see things in black and white, everybody's now looking for somebody to blame. Nobody in this country, in America, wants to take responsibility for the evil that is within them and within us all. So they're always looking for somebody to point the finger at, somebody or something, so that they can absolve themselves of any responsibility for it. That's what's called a scapegoat, boys and girls. Now, the concept of the scapegoat came from, it's an Old Testament type of biblical thing. Back then, the Israelites, it was a theocracy. Politics and religion were the same thing. Politics were religion. And so if you were having, a famine, or there was a drought, or some other tribe was kicking your ass at war, it had to be because God was mad at you for, for your sins. And what they would do was they'd get a goat, and in a big sort of tribal ceremony, they would symbolically place all of their sins in the goat, and then they'd drive it out of the tribe, out of the town, into the desert, where it would die of starvation or exposure. And that would absolve them of their sins. They could blame something else for their problems rather than having to take personal responsibility. And, in America, placing the blame on somebody else, it's a fucking art, for crying out loud, as we're seeing with this whole Littleton, Colorado thing. Now, Uncle Larry's going to go down the list of all the scapegoats